Hey guys, OGalbina here, bringing you guys our next Twitter discussion type video. I know it's been a little bit since our last one. I've been really busy with school, work, real life, all that fun stuff. So unfortunately I haven't been able to put one out, but I got this one ready for you guys today, and I got one coming up hopefully next week as well, and a really cool one. And having people show me their favorite draft league games. We're going to be reacting to some draft league games that people submitted to me on Twitter. So if you guys do enjoy these videos, be sure to drop a like as well as comment down below whether it be something you learned from this video or a discussion topic you would like to see me cover next. And as well, please sub to the channel. I would really appreciate it a ton. We're pushing towards 1,000 by the end of the year, and if you could help me out along that journey, I would really appreciate it. Now, that being said, let's jump into today's question, which is, what is the big mistake you see newer draft league players make consistently? For my example, I said I often see newer players use a lure berry like a Colbur, Shuka, Akka, and then simultaneously have no way of removing the mon that they're luring. I can't really think of a good example off the top of my head, but it's like, say, I had a Sugarberry Gigalith, and I was like, I did this so I could take a +2 EQ from Landorus, but then simultaneously my way of hitting it is Stone Edge for like 30-40%. That's not a very valuable lure. It's not a very valuable item. There's different ways I could either lure or just use my Gigalith more optimally. And I should probably have that lure in another place or have a better defensive game plan for that lander. So that might not be like the most potent example in the world, but it's kind of just like the one that popped into my head when talking about this. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. If you're going to lure something, you should either have a way to really cripple that Pokemon, whether it be T-Wave or, you know, different status conditions, or have a way of just outright beating or just nuking that Pokemon, which I think is really important. So yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump on to the next, our first one, which is going to be for my buddy Kaz, who I think is a very solid player, and he had a really good point in this one. Now, if I don't explain this one correctly, I do apologize. It's a bit of a like tricky concept to explain, and it's something that you start doing the more you play draft, and you realize it in your game plans and the way you play your games, but you don't ever really put it into words, and that's kind of recognizing and creating sequences, which we'll talk about here. So Kaz says, the single largest observation I make about 70% of builds or more is that people prep by placing mons on a team to perform a specific job or role in a vacuum 1v1 scenario without considering how their build actually deliberates the sequences in-game to get those mons to actually succeed at performing their role. So he's basically saying people will have 1v1 Pokemon on a team that are meant to do this specific thing, but they don't have any way of actually facilitating and getting that Pokemon in position to do what they want. The most obvious example, which he says right here, is the Wincon that technically can beat everything and kind of win the game at +1, +2, whatever it is, but has no setup opportunities. So it doesn't ever get that. If I have a DD Salamence that rips through my opponent team at +1, but I can't ever position myself or find a sequence to get in my Salamence to get in that free +1 DD off consistently, it's not a great win con. I'm just looking at on paper at +1 I can win. Okay, how do I get it to +1 so I can win? Is a good example of that. Another one he says is the rocker that loses to every remover. It's great to get up rocks, but if your rocker immediately lets in the rapid spinner or the defogger, you're not really gaining much by setting up those rocks. You're actually better off, if you're going to predict that Pokemon to come in, better off either throwing off an attack, making an aggressive double, something like that to punish that remover coming in, or having a different hazard setter in general. And you can kind of flip that the other way. Same thing with the remover that lets in the stealth rocker for free. Doesn't matter if I defog the rocks away, if that rock type that walls me can come in and set them up again, they're going to be up to stay, unfortunately. At least until I can chip or remove that thing. So I think that's really important to kind of note. But he kind of says it right here. Pokemon really, or Draft League is really about game planning and visualizing sequences. They matter more than like individual pieces. And when you first start draft, you think the opposite. So I think this is a really good point from Kaz. And one example I'll give from my own like personal experience is going to be my finals game versus Matt O'Shea. Now, in all the mocks I did, and I'm sure if you guys watched like the mock analysis and things like that, I talked about it a lot, but I felt very comfortable leading Urshifu because I felt like Urshifu could always put me in an advantageous position early game, because it always put me in a position where I felt like I could get up 2 layers, if not at least 1 layer of hazards on Matt's side with his, you know, very mediocre removal against my team at the very least, and put myself in a really good position going forward. So the sequence that I was talking about would always be leading Urshifu, right? Because I can force out a good majority of Matt's team, whether that be, you know, like Dragapult, Karen Black, you know, Lycanroc Dust, different things like that, and force in something like the Primarina or the Quag if that was his check, but I was assuming Primarina would come, to be completely honest. I go into that, I U-turn out, I bring in my Ferrothorn, I get a free spike, right? Obviously, he's not going to want to stay in on my Ferrothorn. Even if he calls me going for the spike, the most he gains out of that turn is baiting for a Scald Burn, I suppose, which really isn't super smart for Matt, because if I just Power Whip, then he loses to Urshifu immediately. So, typically, what we would see, and it would happen in most all of my mocks, and I wouldn't tell my opponents to play like this because I thought that's how he was going to play in the game, is you would see a hard Solgaleo because it can threaten me out with a fire move, and it walls me to the ends of the earth. Even if I have knockoff, I'm doing 30% the first time, then I'm not breaking sub afterwards. Like, I'm not doing much substantial damage. So, I get a free Seismitoad on that Solgaleo, and I get my rocks up. And at that point, I have a spike and a rocks up, and I get a free knockoff with my Seismitoad, and again, I'm in a phenomenal position going forward. So I felt like that was really advantageous, and I had backup plans too, like if he led Solgaleo, which I think he did actually in the game, I still always U-turn because it's probably Culver Berry, and then I get into my Seismitoad, and I at least get my rocks up. And again, these are all really, really advantageous positions and situations for me. And Seismitoad obviously usually forcing Kyurem, which I can also get a spike up on potentially if he doesn't want to stay in and take that thing on. So it's kind of deliberating and like getting those sequences going so that you know that you can kind of control the flow of the game and things like that. And again, yell at me if I explain that wrong. But I think I kind of got it down explaining it. But Kaz's words here are obviously great too. So you can always, look here. Maybe he explained it a little bit better than I did. Okay. Next up, we have another good one from Robert Panda saying, one mistake I often see is trying to use a heat set that isn't actually good in the matchup. Just because draft is about having text doesn't mean you always need a crazy set to win a game. And I agree with this wholeheartedly. I feel like I see this more on like the YouTube scene and a lot of Wi-Fi players. Because we're making content, we want to make it entertaining for people. We'll kind of force heat shit just to be heat. And I always say it. Some D-Ray does it a lot sometimes too. I'll be like, he won't do it. He'll come up with a set and I'll be like, nah, dude. That's heat just to be heat. Don't do that. And you see it a lot in Wi-Fi. And I have one example, and I know we just talked about BBL and Matt, but I want to talk about a game from Matt's regular season that I think is a good example of this. And again, no shade to Matt. I think Matt's a phenomenal player, great competitor, makes great content, but I think we can all learn from this, and maybe he disagrees, but I think this is a fair criticism, is in his regular season game against Jesse 504. Now, he beat him in semifinals. I actually didn't watch that game, but I know he won that one. So he obviously learned a little bit, obviously. But in his regular season game that he ended up losing to Jesse, he brought a Scarf Porygon 2 to try and lure and KO a Garchomp with Ice Beam, try to knock it out at +1. And it didn't make any sense. Reason being, a defensive Porygon 2, throughout the course of the game, how healthy he was able to keep Porygon 2, he would have always been able to take a +2 hit from that Garchomp. And instead of, trying to lure it with that Scarf Ice Beam, and being, a defensive and offensive liability, honestly, in a lot of instances, because you're Scarf Porygon 2, opposed to being, EV Light and, different things like that. It really put him in a worse position overall because he tried to bring, the heat. And I remember it was in a position where Jesse SD'd, and he probably shouldn't SD'd because he didn't kill a defensive Porygon 2 from the range that it was at. So it wasn't really a smart play on his end to SD. He probably should have taken damage on whatever was in and just clicked Earthquake, because then he could have won with it a little bit later. But he SD'd, Matt went hard into the Porygon. He's like, cool, he's going to stand, and I'm going to knock him out with Ice Beam. He should see that he knocks me out. Not really keeping in mind that Jesse didn't die, or Jesse didn't kill a defensive P2 at +2 from the range he was at. So he's obviously going to switch out, and then he's locked into Ice Beam against Jesse's team, which is, again, really, really tough for him. So I think that's a good example. I'm sure there's a million even worse examples on Wi-Fi, honestly. It's just like the one that popped in my mind because we're thinking about BBL. We're talking about it. And I remember that one explicitly because I watched Jesse play in Call, and I was like, why the hell is he Scarf Porygon Z? Or Porygon 2. Not Porygon Z. That's a good Scarfer. So I think that's a good example of it. Again, no shade to Matt whatsoever. I think, again, he's a phenomenal player. And a great creator. But it's just instances like that. I see it a lot on Wi-Fi, personally. All right, next we have Lackness with a bunch of examples. Let's go one at a time. Mon that's slower takes sand damage first. That's a good thing to note, especially for new players in general. I believe it's Hail as well. That if your Pokemon... Wait. No, I think is he saying this backwards? Hold on. Mon that's slower takes sand damage first. Isn't it the opposite? I'm pretty sure it was the opposite. Okay, I think he's saying like people getting it mixed up, because unless I'm tripping, and maybe I need to learn something in this video, I'm pretty sure the Mon that's faster is going to take sand and hail damage first, so that's something to keep in mind. Mon that's slower should get healed by terrain first. If he's talking about grassy terrain, that's actually not true. It's not a mechanic, and a lot of people think if a Pokemon gets healed by grassy terrain first, that means it's faster. It's not the case with grassy terrain for some reason. Don't know why, but it's not. Mon that's slower has its ability to activate first. Okay, so I know he's definitely doing the opposite. So say you're in an instance where you have a Tapu Koko and a Tapu Lele. You have a Tapu Lele, they have a you have a Tapu Koko, they have a Tapu Lele. Your Koko comes out and electric terrain activates first, and then what do you call it? The psychic terrain activates. That means that your Koko is faster than that Lele. Again, unless I'm absolutely mixing these up. The way he worded this has me like second guessing everything I know about Pokemon right now. But I believe it, because, yeah, the slower weather setter will also go second. So if your Koko goes first and then the Lele happens, that means that it's not a Scarf Lele. And if the Lele's terrain pops first, then your Koko's, that means it's a Scarf Lele. So that's something to keep in mind. Same thing with weather. Pelipper's going to set Drizzle, and then if a Torkoal sent in, it's going to set it afterwards, because it's probably going to be slower. So something to keep in mind. Lakiness, I want to fight you for the way you fucking worded that, man. That was really, really frustrating. Oh my goodness. I'd be thinking I was an idiot. And it's too late in the video for me to start over because I sounded super dumb because the way he worded that. But they're great points though, and I'm just messing with them. I'm not, nobody's actually mad. But those are great points though. Good things to keep a note, and it's just kind of like small little game knowledge things to keep note of when you're learning how to play. And then this is a good one. What the hell? That was Scarfed. It sees it a lot on Wi-Fi. I feel like the reason you see that on Wi-Fi is because you're making content, or the people that are playing are making content. They're really immersed in the game, as well as, trying to provide commentary, and they'll miss out on little tiny things. Like, for example, when D-Ray was playing Mountay and APA, we were watching it in Call Live, and he rapid spun with his Starmie, and then a Lele came in. He was like, word, I'm going to flip turn because I want to scout and see if this thing's Scarf. And in my head, I'm like, well, D-Ray, you have no way of confirming if this is Scarf, because you rapid spun your +1 right now. He outsped it, flip turned out, and he was like, word, it's not Scarf, I'm good. And then later in the game, lost his Tauros, which is his way of winning, to a Scarfed Lele, and he's like, wait, it wasn't Scarf, was it a speed tie? It's just like kind of paying attention to little things like that, or knowing your own speed tiers. Again, just paying attention to the game, taking notes is so important, in my mind too, in Wi-Fi. So another thing to keep in mind. Jeez, Lakiness. That's me stumbling over my words. Next up, we have Endless saying, I see newer players constantly using excuses and blaming hacks for losses. If you want to improve, you need to analyze your replays and see why you could have played better and prepped better instead of using excuses an easy way out. This is true. As much as someone who even himself complains about hacks and losing and things like that, when we do get hacked, and there is a layer of truth to it, right? If we get hacked in a game, it puts us in a worse spot. It might take something away from us that was in our odds, but you will never lose a game because of one hacksy turn. There is, at least 99% of the time, I feel like I can say that. There's always a turn where you could have played better, where you could have played a little bit more optimally. There's always usually at least a couple turns where you could have played better and put yourself in a better position. So blaming an entire game on one play is pretty tough. Now, there are games where it feels like you just simply can't play at all, and those are a little bit more tough. But again, for the most part, I feel like you can say like, hey, I got hacked in this instance on these couple turns, but looking back on turn 3, I should have done blank. On turn 6, I maybe didn't make the right play and staying in right here. Things like that. So a good example is my own game in my SBT video against Zane. I got, pretty decently unlucky, but then when I watched back the game when I was recording it for that thing, I played so much worse than I realized. So much worse. Like that turn 1 play where I just stayed in with my Nidoking because I didn't think he would Earthquake on his Ice Score. Like there was a needlessly aggressive play that I made for no reason, and I got punished for it, and that put me in a bad position the rest of the game. My Nidoking was great in that game. It was my main way of checking Nidolego, which ended up beating me. So despite me getting hacked out and all that stuff, I think that stuff's really, really important to note. So that's a good one by Endless here. Next up, we have Aquarius saying, not identifying win conditioning, attacking what's in front of them without thinking forward to an execute an endgame, or identifying a win condition early in the game and sacking it early. So yeah, these are all just kind of not playing turn by turn. And I feel like a lot of new players will see this. They'll say, okay, I can live this hit, so I'm going to live this hit and take something out. Say like, I have my Immense out, right? And there's a Swampert out on the other side. I know that I can live an Ice Beam, and then this thing's in 2-hit KO range, so I'm like, word, I'm just going to Dragon Claw or Dueling Beat 2-hit KO this Swampert and take it out. Cool, Swampert's gone. Then I got a 10% Salamence. That was my win con, and I can't, well, it was my best way of winning, say. And I can't win the game with it anymore. So I guess it kind of ties into a bunch of these. We're not identifying that Salamence is our win condition in that instance. We're attacking what's in front of us without thinking what's going to happen in the end game, where I needed that Salamence to win. Or say it was a fatter, bulkier Salamence, and I needed to check a Mienshao or something like that. You know, obviously you can have stars, but you know what I mean. Say there's a Scarf Mienshao that just runs me, and it just locks into CC or HJK the rest of the game and beats me, because I let that Mence take chip. So it's really about kind of looking a couple turns ahead. Now, it's not necessarily to say like you have to have the foresight to know what's going to happen on turn 17 exactly, but it's identifying, I need this or I lose to this. I need this to win later. I need this to break through this Pokemon because nothing else on my team can kill it. So I need to make sure I keep it healthy. Even if I can take a hit and, you know, revenge a Pokemon, maybe I need that health on X Pokemon in order to not just like raw lose the game. So this is a really good point from Aquarius, and I think it's something that a lot of newer players, you know, kind of need to keep in mind. Okay, let's see. Next up, we have Kirby saying players think they need to build defensive checks to offensive monster. This is kind of paired with what Kaz said or has said. But new players always get fucked up by Mega Maw and Mega Medi because they try and beat them defensively instead of offensively pressuring them and punishing them for attacking. I agree. And again, maybe this is a little bit of personal bias shining through. I feel like this is why people say like, Urshifu's fucking nuts. Broken Mon. Or back in Gen 7, like Kurt was mentioning, Mega Mawile. I remember back early Gen 7, Mega Mawile was banned in a majority of leagues. Now I have not seen a Mega Mawile banned in a Nat Dex league or a Gen 7 league in so long. Because I feel like back in the day, people were like, well, how do I beat it? I can't switch into it no matter what. True. There's very little defensive counterplay to a Mega Mawile. The way you beat Mega Mawile is pivoting around it, identifying what coverage it has, pivoting around it, and beating it offensively, exploiting its very mediocre speed tier, and, you know, its meh-ish bulk. It's not the worst bulk in the world, but it's not phenomenal bulk. Same thing with Urshifu. I think it really does, one, take punishing it for attacking and Rocky Helmets and things like that, chipping it down in the range of Pokemon that are faster, and it's not impossible, even if it's Scarf Urshifu, it's not impossible to have a Scarfer over the speed tier of, at the speed tier of like 100 and above, really. So there really is plenty of ways to revenge it, especially from the special side where it has a very, very mediocre special defense. It's 4 times weak to Fairy, the type that it's usually getting checked by and things like that. So these are all just things to keep in mind. You might not always have a phenomenal defensive matchup against something, but that doesn't mean you outright lose to it. You just have to approach that game a little bit different. You have to ensure it doesn't get free switch-ins to things that can't pressure it back or live a hit and potentially revenge it. Or you have to have great ways of aftershocking a Pokemon, coming in and exerting pressure for yourself, which I think is important. So next up, we see John Jr. saying easy no win con, just bringing the best 6 mons they have and having no end game to play for. This kind of touches on what, oops, I just clicked on the wrong thing. This kind of touches on what Aquarius was saying, kind of what Kaz was saying, where people are just kind of like, okay, Urshifu is really good. I guess Urshifu is always going to do good. What's another one? Let's say I have Magnezone. Magnezone is good at trapping Celesteela. Okay, for what? Let's say I have a Mega Charizard X. Mega Charizard X is really good in this game. It doesn't have a lot of switch-ins. You know, just like kind of bringing Pokemon without having a way of bringing the best out of them and facilitating that endgame. So I guess we kind of already talked about that, so I probably shouldn't say too much on that. Let's see. Next up, we have Soulblaze saying justifying their strategies in draft, prep, and play from casual playthrough experience. Now, I'm not too familiar with people doing this. Now, this might be because I don't play with a lot of people who are, like, brand new to draft anymore. But I could see it happening, potentially. Like, if you were brand new to draft, you have not really played competitive Pokemon prior to, you know, the instance that you're at, or, like, the place that you're at. Kind of thinking, like, oh, well, these moves were good in my playthrough. This Mon was awesome when I used it as a kid, so it's really good now. But I feel like that's just kind of learning how to play competitive Pokemon and kind of, like, getting your toes wet in the scene. I remember my first league, I brought Dusclops to my first game, and it did good. It got like a kill or two, and I brought it for like 4 games straight. Terrible Mon, hate Dusclops. Same thing with Luxray, actually. Luxray got like 2 kills in like the first game I ever played, and I brought it so many times over the next couple weeks because I thought it was broken because it got a bunch of kills. I was like, let's go. This Mon's super sick. I also didn't know what Toxic Spikes were because I never played through them in a casual playthrough. I'd never played them on Battle Spot because it's just, you know, 3v3 short metagame. So, I kind of get what he means, but I feel like that's just kind of like learning what, draft is, what competitive Pokemon is. So if you're just starting a draft and you want to use your favorite Pokemon, I don't think that's too big of a deal. Say like Dragonite is just your favorite Pokemon of all time, so you draft it round 1, pick 5. It's your first ever league. You're like, I really want to use my boy. Hell yeah, draft that Dragonite. You might get smashed a little bit. And again, that's not saying Dragonite's bad. But you know what I mean? Like, you might get smashed because you're drafting just a bunch of random shit because it looks fun and you're like, I like these Pokemon, I think they're good. But that's how you learn. Okay. Next up is Badass Frostlass saying, ignoring low tiers, both their own and their opponents. This is actually something I used to struggle with heavy. I was the king of getting swept by mons like Alolan Raichu and different low tier sweepers and things like that, or just like not having a switch into a Passimian because I was like, it's not in their top 6, so then I'm gonna kind of overlook it and have very floppy, flimsy checks to it. Early in my draft career, I really struggled with this, so I think this is a great point by Badass Frostlass here. That was something I really struggled with for a long time. Now, it's not to say you have to hyper-specific prep for everything that your opponent might bring, right? I think another really big skill in draft is obviously evaluating a matchup and kind of looking and saying, all right, what are my opponent's best 6 to 8 Pokemon on their draft that they can realistically bring versus me? If I were them, what would I bring versus me? Things like that. Still accounting for most of the things on your opponent's team, but if you look at your opponent's draft and they have an Amoonguss and you're like, dude, I have the best Amoonguss matchup of all time. If it comes, I'm not super scared of it, then you should be fine. Also, because if you have that good of a matchup against Amoonguss, you probably don't need to prep too heavy for it. So it's just something to keep in mind, being able to evaluate a matchup and kind of look from top to bottom, not just that top 6, that top 8, kind of, keeping in mind that that Alolan Raichu is sitting in the back, ready to come and fuck you up. All right, next up we have Gohan saying, not properly considering how the opponent will react to the possibility of your prep. And then he has another one here too in a second that he's going to talk about. I think this is fair. I think it's good to kind of, and this is, I think, as you get a little bit better at the game and the more you play, is kind of considering how your opponent is going to approach the matchup, just like how you're going to approach the matchup and things like that. What they're going to be scared of and how you can potentially exploit that, which specific switches you can force because your opponent has to play around, you being X set or you being X item or things like that. I think that's really important. It can always put you in really, really good positions, and not reacting properly to it is, obviously going to put you in a little bit less great positions. Next up, we have Gohan again, saying, another one is overestimating the extent of which mocks help you prepare for the real game. And I think this is fair. One, I think mocks are really kind of just dependent on the person, right? I think some people are going to love mocks, some people are going to not really enjoy them and not get much benefit from them. I know Kurt does not like mocks. I personally love mocks. I love mocks, and I think you have to approach them from a standpoint of, I need to be comfortable with my team. I need to be comfortable with my sequences, how I'm going to position my team, how I'm going to use these Pokemon. You should not go into a mock saying, well, 3 people in my mocks brought X set. That means it has to come. This is what he's bringing. Because then you really, really tunnel on what your mocks give you. And the game is completely different. Because I've never had a mock where the game has gone exactly similar to any one of the mocks at all. So I think that's important personally. So that's a good point for Gohan. And again, it's understanding, do mocks benefit you, or is it just that a lot of people do mocks? So you kind of have to realize, does it benefit you as a player? Does it help you prepare? Okay, next up we have Traxo. He said, let me pull up my BBR team, be right back. He said, drafting mainly physical or special breakers / offense, but not both. This is fair to an extent. I think people overestimate this a little bit. I think it's important to obviously be able to hit from both sides, but it's also nice in an instance to have kind of that overload feature to your draft where you just raw beat down with physical offense or special offense. Now, it might give you some more disadvantageous matchups. Say you have just like some beat down crazy special offensive, breaking core, but then you're pulling up on a Blissey. It's going to be a little bit more tough for you to break through. But there are a lot of teams, especially in a draft format where you can be so customizable with your coverage and your items and your movesets and things like that, that are going to be overwhelmed if they have to check multiple things with the same 1 to 2 Pokemon. Because they're often not going to have 87 Spadef walls for your 87 special attackers, if that makes sense. I do think it's important to have a mix of both. Obviously, being able to force in that Spadef wall, maybe get a free switch into your your physically offensive breaker and punch a hole there, and vice versa. So that's important. Now, next is saying drafting a Shipmon because of typing is good. I had a Alolan Dougie as a steal. This is a fair point, for sure. I definitely don't think you should be drafting a Alolan Dougie as your steal. I think it really does come down to one, proper drafting, which I'm a really bad drafter, so I'm not even saying that like, you guys draft bad. I'm a terrible drafter. There's so often where I'll have a team where I just hate the whole season because I don't draft correctly. But I think this is fair. Just saying like, I need a grass type, so I'm drafting Maractus. I need a steel type, so I'm drafting Dougie. Maybe make some transactions, and you know, if your team really does need those roles filled, do that. But don't necessarily draft a Pokemon just because it is that typing and be like, all right, I'm good. Kind of recognize, does that Pokemon fit in the role that I need that typing to fulfill, like, functionally? And Dougie as, like, a fat steel rocker Typemon, not really going to do so, unfortunately. Next up is you need hazards and removal. Even if you don't plan on having them every game, forcing your opponent to prep for them is a must. This is fair. Obviously, you don't want to have no rocks and no removal. That puts you in a terrible spot. However, I think in Generation 8, something to keep in mind is how insignificant the impact, or not insignificant, that's like a way overstatement, how much less important hazards are opposed to a Gen 7, Gen 6 metagame. Now, if you were to tell me this is in Gen 7, Gen 6, I'll be like, hell yeah, you do. Good stuff. I 100% agree. But I think having your opponent, you know, forcing your opponent even into bringing boots or bringing rapid spin on Xmon is, you know, potentially really, really nice and stuff like that. But obviously with boots being a thing, I don't think hazards are as valuable. It's more so just like what he said here and like forcing your opponent to prep for them. Next one is one I don't agree with though, and it's drafting so top heavy that you're forced to bring the same 6 every week. I think if you draft a good top heavy draft, that's incorrect, personally. If my top 5 to 6, look at my BBL team, I just won a championship with a team where I brought the same 5 every week and then I flexed into 6. It was phenomenal. The team paired together phenomenally, and I really enjoyed using the team. It covered all my grounds. I was able to play with it very comfortably. If all of my top 5 out of my 6 or all my 6 Pokemon are really good in most matchups because they synergize so well, what's wrong with that? Now, you can make the argument that it's boring. You don't want to. That's fair. But I think drafting so top heavy, they're forced to bring the same 6 is not a big deal. Even in BBR, which he's kind of talking about right here, whatever the most recent season BBR was, they had like really, really whack tiers. It was really, everything was really, really expensive. They like took that Wi-Fi League approach where everything was like dummy expensive. I drafted super top heavy, brought the same 5 out of 6, and had a great season. So, that's something important. And then he says, speed tiers are probably the most misunderstood thing. It's not about having the fastest Mon on the field. I explain more about what you're here to do, and you're right. That is what I'm here to do, Mr. Trek. So I agree. So what he's saying is like, you don't have good speed tiers because you have a Noivern. If you have a Noivern and then you go down to Victini, you have shitty speed tiers. Speed tiers, the whole purpose of them is to force Mons in that speed tier bracket above you to not be able to run free, modest, or adamant in every matchup because you have a 15 plus point gap. So you should have a buffer of around 10 to less than 15 in between all of those different speed tiers. So you should have them on, like the best example is the, you know, the 100 and up speed tier kind of gap. You should have them on at 100, you should have them on around 110, or around 100, doesn't have to be exactly. If you have a 98, whatever. You have a Hydra, whatever. Around 100, around 110, and something around 115 or above 115, I think is really, really important. Now, it gets a little bit more muddy. Say I have a Whimsicott at 115, then I also have a Zeraora at 142. Do I need something at 130? Not necessarily, especially because it's such a hard speed tier to fill, especially when you already have your elite speed tier in Zeraora and you have a really fast model Whimsicott. You're not always going to be able to fit something in between, but you're also forcing those 130 Mons, like a Mon at 130, to not run Adamant or Modest versus you. And there's not really a lot in between 130 and 140, if that makes any sense. So I think that's very, very important, obviously, to have. And it's not just, again, like he said, having the fastest Mon, it's having a good kind of, having good levels in between your speed tiers where people can't, really, really exploit you. Okay. Next up, we have Liv saying, new players. I drafted a team without removal. I have 2 picks left. Oh no, also new players. I think this Armaldo will help. I now have a rapid spinner, therefore I'm safe against hazards. I can play this every week, so I never have to worry about rocks and Zard. Why? Basically, a comedic way of saying new players will draft a single Mon that barely will do a role. It was drafted for and acting like it fixes a major team issue. Removal isn't mandatory this gen, to be fair, unless you're drafting yard. Hence the analogy. This is a great point by Liv. We kind of just talked about with Trexo a little bit, but it's not going to fix your draft if you, again, need rapid spin, you draft an Armaldo, unfortunately, Mr. Amel. So I think making sure that you're filling those roles is important, obviously, but make sure you're filling them with Pokemon that can succeed in fulfilling those roles. If you have a Pokemon that needs you to remove, say you're playing Nandex and you have a Zard Y, you need good removal almost every week, unless your opponent has terrible hazard game, which we talked about a little bit earlier. you need good removal, obviously, to keep those rocks away. And Armaldo isn't a mon that's coming out of 8 out of 8 weeks, unfortunately. So this is a good point by Liv. Next up, we have the Nathaniel Shaniel saying removal good, speed tiers. So removal good. I think this is him saying like it's good to have removal, which I agree. Again, I think it's a little bit less needed this gen, but you still definitely need it. Speed tiers, which you just talked about. Firewater Dragon, I almost said. Firewater Grass and Fairy Dragon Steel cores aren't mandatory. That's fair. The cores themselves are not mandatory, 100%. But there are certain typings in those cores that I do think are mandatory. I think you need a Fairy. I think you need a Steel. I think you need a Water. The other ones are very much so more up for debate. Now, Fire, don't think you need it at all. If it benefits your team to have an offensive Fire type or even a defensive fire type like an Arcanine because you're super weak to Ice or X typing, that's fair. Get you a Fire type. You don't need it on draft to succeed. Grass, same thing. If you need a good ground resist, a lot of teams will have grasses because they need it as their ground resist. But if I have a Buzzwole, I'm not going to tell you that you need to go get a grass to resist ground. You don't. You have a Buzzwole. And then Dragon, again, a lot of Dragon types are great Pokemon, so you see them a lot. But you don't need a Dragon to have a functional great draft, in my opinion. Don't rely on only setup offense. This is fair. Make sure you have your good mix of, obviously, depending on your playstyle. Is first and foremost. Obviously, if you're playing more hyper offensive, you don't need to rely on a solid balanced defensive backbone. But if you're playing more bulky offense balance, make sure you have that solid defensive backbone. Make sure you have strong breakers and good speed control and things like that. And, maybe facilitate that setup offense to win. You also don't need setup offense to win the game. In BBL, I barely ever brought setup on the team because it was so momentum heavy, and I had so many strong, reliable breakers and scarfers that can clean up in the end game. So I think that's important. Don't be afraid to double up on types, but don't double up on too much rolls. I think we talk about this a little bit later. But he's saying, like, drafting double water. And I know Josh talks about this later in the thread, so I'm going to leave that one, but that is a good point. Hazards are good. Removal is also good, apparently. Hazards are good. I think webs are bad, personally. I'm not a big webs guy in Gen 8, especially in a boots metagame, but rocks are important. Spikes are great in specific matchups, especially when you have good knockoff users, things like that, but I don't like it. Look at what people are drafting after you and see if you can wait on a pick. This is fair. This is more of a drafting thing, which is an important part of Draft League, which we haven't really mentioned up to this point, in the sense that, say, I need, in my draft, right, I'm pick 15, or I'm pick 13. It's round 2. I really want Aegislash and Nidoqueen on my team. I look behind me, and everybody behind me has a Steel type. Now, Aegislash is obviously a better Pokemon than Nidoqueen. It's valued higher. But chances are, if 3 people behind me all have a Steel type, they are probably not taking Aegislash. I should take Nidoqueen because it's more likely to be sniped for me. And I'm going to take Aegislash on that way back around. Is what makes sense. So look at what your people who are drafting after you have after you, so that you can sufficiently plan and position yourself to be a little bit better in that sense with those mons. Next up, we have Jayber saying drafting teams of ship mons to fill roles. You don't need every type, and sometimes your removal will just be subpar. Sorry if you heard a little beep. Oh, I'm not down far enough. Just because a mon doesn't mean it is. But yeah, I think we've already talked about that. Also, knowing your lead sequences before the game, especially in Amon, it's pretty easy to figure out the lead according to the plan for each opposing lead. This is good. And this is something I really struggled with. I'm not scrolled down far enough again. This is something I really struggled with early on because I'm like, why would I have a designated lead? I'm just going to go in, I'm going to look at my opponent's team, and I'm going to figure out what the best lead is. But it's smart to kind of go into a game and plan out the lead sequence in your head, right? Say I'm playing in a game and I'm playing an Urshifu Single Strike, and I don't have Pokemon that can consistently switch an Urshifu Single Strike. I want to make sure I lead in a way that I don't immediately give up a KO. So I might lead my Scarfer that's faster. I might lead my Frail Fairy type. Say I have Gardevoir as my Fairy type. I might lead Gardevoir because I'll live a Wicked Blow, or I could be Scarf. I might die to Bandit, but I could be Scarf Guard, lead it, and I prevent myself from immediately giving up a Pokemon turn 1, or putting myself in a terrible position and getting put in the Vortex or something like that. Or vice versa. I know my opponent can't guard against my Urshifu. I'm going to lead it, and I'm going to click a button on that kind of thing. So it's kind of good to plan out your leads in advance so that you know, so that you can put yourself in a good position turn 2, 3, 4, things like that. Don't lead your Landers because you see Landers let a lot. Don't lead your Ferrothorn because you see Ferrothorn let a lot. Kind of take into account what your opponent has, how you guard against it, and how they guard against you. Next up, we have the most important point of the entire video, and Alex Cool Rocket saying, I often see new players drafting bad and making the wrong plays. If I was a Draft League player, I'd simply just draft the best Pokemon every time, and I would never let my Pokemon die. It's that simple. And I agree, Mr. Alex Cool Rocket. If you guys don't want to lose your draft league games, just don't lose them. Just don't lose your Pokemon. Let them all live and knock out all your opponent's Pokemon before you get your Pokemon knocked out. And you can too be like Alex Cool Rocket, Twitter Draft League Superstar. All right, next up we have the one from Josh here that I was talking about. In saying misunderstanding the pros and cons of double typings. It's okay to have two waters like Milotic and Crawdon. They're very different Pokemon. Doubling and tripling up on typing is okay so long as you're not getting Tangrowth or Mugas or something dumb like that. So what he's saying is, and water types are the best one to explain this for me, right? Because you'll see a lot of teams, like my SBT team where I had Gren Prim, or different teams like that, where they'll have two water types, but it's fine because one of those water types functions in a completely different role and way than the other one. Like in this example, Milotic is going to be that fat, annoying, bulky water that pivots, going to flip, turn out. It's going to chew up Spadef hits. It's going to potentially eat up Fizdef hits if it's like Flame Orb or something like that. It's going to be a nuisance. Crawdon is there to be frail and strong as hell and come in and click a button. You position it offensively and you click a button. You're not using Crawdon as your bulky water. You're not using Crawdon as your Darmanitan check. I sure hope you aren't, at least. So I think that at least your defensive check. You can offensively check it, force it out with Aqua Jets, things like that. Maybe set up on it, something like that. But I think that's really important to note here from Josh. This is definitely a really, really good point. Although the Tangrowth Amoonguss core is a regen core, as Lux says. So, you know what? I agree. Maybe this wasn't a great example. Tangrowth plus Amoonguss, they both have regen. So that must mean that they're both good, right? Together. You just spam regen. How many more do we have? We just finished Josh, so we can kind of go down from there. Oh my goodness. We have Hella. Okay, we got this. We got this. We're going to zoom through them. People stress themselves on getting a mediocre wish passer on their hyper offense team that doesn't receive wishes very well just to have one. And their only potential knockoff uses Alakazam or a single mover like Bortroll. This is fair. Again, this is kind of just saying, like, I need this because other people draft it. If your team doesn't need wish pass, if your team doesn't need X roll, don't do it. You have to recognize the playstyle that you're using and the team that you're using, opposed to just saying, like, I'm bringing I drafted Licky Licky because I like him. He passes good wishes into my HO team that doesn't really appreciate it. Honestly, I feel like I made that exact mistake in BBL, where I had a very, very offensive Volt Turn Happy core, and I drafted a really passive Licky Licky, and I only brought it one time the entire season. Despite me loving that Pokemon, I brought it one time the entire season. It was a choice band Licky Licky. So, like, I think it's really important to note those kinds of things. Another specific instance would be a matchup where you face DNC. If you can't beat Deft or Diamond Storm Boost, which is a 50% chance an argument most spam move, is your prep is bad and you can't call it hacks. It's a really common mistake I've made myself before. So I guess it's just kind of accounting for secondary effects, I suppose, or just taking in different instances. It's just like it is a very, very specific example. Maybe he's like kind of taking from his own day to day. But I could see it in that sense. Next, we see Skyrider saying, focusing on only big threats and forgetting to move full blast Mons. A good example is seeing Tauros beat Garchomp thanks to sheer force Ibream, or seeing Machamp using no guard Fire Blast to Oko, Fairy Thorn, or Scizor. That's fair. We kind of talked about that already, but, taking into account your opponent's lower tier threats and what they can do versus you in a matchup. Next, we have Fran saying, thinking Mega Scizor is bad just because it can always sweep every matchup. I don't know why he really likes, Mega Scizor, which is fair, but the Mega video was before, so, I don't know. Mega Scizor's good, I agree, for sure. But, yeah, I don't know. U-turn with Mega Scizor, apparently. Okay, next is bring the same 6 sets every week and bring surprise for your SDC. Lucha is getting walled every time. Not taking the time to learn basic speed creeping, not keeping an open mind to learn constructive criticisms from player. Okay, so we'll talk about the first one. Same 6 sets every time. You see this a lot in, like, really, really new draft. Like, I just started playing. I'm bringing these moves on this Pokemon because of what runs and Smoke on, something like that. Like, again, this is my first or second league, and this is fair. Obviously, draft is a counter-team format. You have to counter-team what your opponent has and kind of build accordingly. So, yeah, obviously, you're not going to succeed very well if you're just bringing, whatever, 4 moves that you want to bring without taking into account your opponent's team. Not taking the time to learn basic speed creeping, I feel like it's also very early. Speed creeping is very important. It gets you really, really important EVs that might make you live a hit. Might give you a little bit more attack or special attack to get a 2-hit KO or an Oko, things like that. So I think that's really, really important. And then not keeping an open mind to learn constructive criticism from other players. And he does note, he's saying constructive because flaming someone for their poor play is not constructive, and that's fair. You don't want to shit on someone because they played bad. Now, being open-minded, saying like, hey, this was not the right play because of X thing. You could have done this instead and maybe had a better result. It's very, very important. And even good players should be able to take constructive criticism. It's not just new players, not just people who aren't very good at the game. There's a million instances where I've made terrible plays, and I consider myself a good Pokemon player. I really do. Call me cocky, but I do think I'm pretty good at the game. But there's obviously so many instances in which I've played bad. I didn't even make playoffs in APA this year. And I consider myself a great player. I did not play very good this season, so it happens. So next up, we'll go down to Iris, and she says, most of them value webs way too much, like they're going to win every week, when in all reality, you don't use them all too much. I do agree a ton. We kind of talked about it. I think webs in a metagame, like in Gen 7, webs is kind of like not terrible, and you'd see them on more hyper offensive teams and things like that, but it was kind of like the telltale sign of like someone who's newer to the format. They're like, webs are broken because then I'm faster than everything, herder. I think especially in Gen 8, that's a big thing. I really don't like webs in Gen 8. If I draft a Pokemon that has webs, I'm probably not drafting it for webs, in my opinion. I think it's a huge trap to kind of draft and be like, oh, I need webs because it helps out my offense, when removal is so widespread in defog because of Usum, the rapid spin buff, and especially heavy duty boots existing. I just can't really justify being like, yeah, dude, I need having webs or something. I don't know. Usually when I play webs, I don't even bring removal. I just bring boots and the mons that would be affected by them, or really hate them. And then it's gonna say I see people value weird mons a lot. I think that's just newer players. And again, we kind of talked about it earlier. If you're really new to the format and you really want to try Pokemon, draft it, dude. You'll learn if you like it or not. You'll learn if you think it's broken, and you'll learn if it's, you know, really good or not. I don't think that's too big of a deal there. Like Urshifu Rabbit taking 4th overall, it's a good Pokemon. You're not taking Dusclops round 1, so like not that big of a deal in my opinion. There's probably much better things you can pick at 4th pick, but you know, is it the end of the world that you drafted pick 4 Urshifu Rabbit Strike? Not really, to be honest. So I think that's at least important to kind of clarify. Next up, we have Celestial, or is it just Celeste? I don't know. Saying roll compression. I've seen people try and force 1 mon extra points into too many rolls and then wonder why it sucks ass. Example, drafting Eldegoss your only spinner plus EQs just because you drafted a super ground weak team. This is fair. Again, I think it kind of specs into drafting low tier mons that aren't very good to fit a really important role in your team because you feel like you need it. Roll compression isn't a bad thing, provided the Pokemon and the purpose you need that like on your team. I don't know. I think that's something important to note too. Like I think roll compression and getting like a Drapion that has a dark type that gets T-spikes and can absorb T-spikes is super clutch. Or like a Nidoqueen, which is a grounded poison, a rocker, and a ground type. That's great roll compression. But yeah, if you're roll compressing into an Eldegoss, or if you're drafting an Eldegoss on purpose, stop it. Get some help. That's probably not a good idea. Next up, we have a bunch here from Seth saying, something that I've dealt with is proper draft playing, having the bright idea of blowing up my face. Basically taking a long look at a doc and making a draft plan just to get the best Pokemon while you can. Taking care of necessary and key rolls. Those necessary and key rolls would be hazards and removal of them, which we'll still getting a bunch of hitters. So I kind of get what you're saying here in the sense like maybe hyper focusing on I need these specific Pokemon to win isn't a great idea. I don't think there's anything wrong with planning once you get to a certain point in the draft, like round 4 or 5, saying I want this next round, I want the round after, and then it's just kind of being able to be flexible and adjust. I think is really important. What actually I guess he talks about that. I mean, getting sniped to Frizz, I wouldn't tell the I would tell them don't freak out and go to the draft plan you have in place and go with the second or third option you wanted. So yeah, I'm kind of somewhere from where I've been talking for like 45 minutes straight. I'm trying to keep these under an hour, so I've been going fast. But yeah, I guess I kind of just said it before I even read his tweet. Yeah, it's just kind of not necessarily pigeonholing and saying I need to get this plan, these specific Pokemon, these specific order, or I lose the game. Next up, we have Garrison. Cast spoke heavily into what I noticed. While I as draft players often see game plan in a linear and pattern basis rather than a set of repeating patterns that you can design for your team to take advantage. If a threat only has 1 mon, it can come in on pressure. Design your set to take advantage of it. If your threats overlap on a check, make sure they're attacking on a different axis so you can pressure that check properly. Patterns are important to abuse them. So this is, again, it just kind of goes back on sequencing and positioning and kind of getting your own Pokemon into a position to win the game, opposed to just bringing 6 Pokemon that do good and trying to position yourself well. So next you see Wall 2 spreads. I think early in draft it's not the biggest in the world. Like if you're your first or second league and you don't know how to speed creep, you don't feel comfortable doing it, not the biggest deal in the world, but it obviously is, you know, going to be very valuable to know how to speed creep and know how to optimally, you know, get the most out of your Pokemon EV-wise. Next up, we have a couple more. Oh, we only have 3 more. I'm sure you guys can hear it in my throat. I'm so tired. I see a lot of players rely on setup sweepers over prediction. Highly offensive builds with defensive backbone have a hard time stall breaking once their breakers get killed. Okay, so let's talk about this. Relying on setup sweepers, we already talked about. Over prediction is definitely fair. There are instances where you need to predict, you need to make a play, you can make a calculated risk, and there are instances where you can't. And I think the biggest time where you can do that, especially when you see like early game, where someone makes a big prediction that blows up in their face and then they're in a terrible position. Do not make a prediction early in the game that can lose you the game unless you need to make it to win the game. I know that sounds super confusing because I feel like I just said like a million words at the same time that were very similar, but you should not feel pressured to make a play unless you feel like you are going to lose or be put in a terrible position if you don't make that play, if that makes any sense. Now, let's say I'm in with, I can't even think of a good example. Say my opponent has a very easy switch in and I knock out their Pokemon very easily and I'm in with my Mon. I know they're going to switch, but if they don't and I make a double into a Pokemon that, you know, takes advantage of said Pokemon that's coming in and they just stay in an attack and I lose that Pokemon, I could be in a terrible spot. So it's at least in my best interest to, you know, just attack what's in front of me, at least for the time being, unless it's in a late game position where I need to predict it and double in so I put myself in a good offensive position. There's times to be aggressive and make predictions, and there's times not to be. Highly offensive builds with a little defensive backbone. This one I don't agree with. I think if you're playing HO, you're playing with a more offensive playstyle, you don't really need the defensive backbone if you're playing the playstyle properly. So I think it just really comes down to playstyle. Having a hard time stall breaking once the breaker gets killed or is at low health. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think people really struggle when they see really fat, balanced, stall builds. They freak out a little bit and they don't really prepare properly. It's not necessarily like once their breakers get low. Obviously, if you let your breakers get low, you probably aren't. Or if you lost your breaker against, like, you know, your main way is breaking the stall team, I guess. You're gonna be in a bad time, and that's kind of just on you. So, next one we have. Oh, and then we have Josh not planning around snipes, which we just talked about. And the last one we have Pokemon Trainer Orange saying, easiest mistake is not doing research. See a lot of players lose to necessity because they have no idea how certain abilities / moves work. I had someone forget how inner focus work with Intimidate in a 1-minute game in prep alone. And yeah, this is again completely fair. Knowing what a Pokemon can do will do potentially against you and your specific build, knowing what its move pool is, what potential items it is, it really does help you in preparing and really buckling down and, you know, identifying what's good against you and what's good against your opponent. So I think that's definitely fair. But we're gonna end it before 50 minutes, which is awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, again, be sure to drop a like and sub if you're new. We're on our way to 1,000, and I really appreciate it. I need to stop recording. I need to stop talking about Pokemon or I'm gonna explode. Thank you guys again, though. I'll see you later.